Hey there, Quillers. Jake Lloyd here, producer of Don't Quill the Messenger and co-founder of Dragon Wagon Radio. I just wanted to take a quick moment to tell you about my debut feature film, Pinch. Pinch is the story of two strangers brought together by the chance to own a rare and valuable sports collectible. But to do so, they're tasked with stepping out of their comfort zones and onto a baseball field. It is a story about marriage, family, how we define success, and how sometimes it's hard to look beyond our own insecurities. I made Pinch with no budget, no crew, just a ton of heart, and I am thrilled to share it with you. It's available for rent or purchase digitally on Prime Video. Visit pinchmovie.com and follow @pinchmovie on Instagram for more info on this charming little movie that means the world to me. Thank you so much for listening to Dragon Wagon Radio. I appreciate your time, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Don't Quill the Messenger. Cue the music. It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, fellow Quillers, to another exciting episode of your favorite podcast, Don't Quill the Messenger, brought to you by the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, go to their website, shakespeareoxfordfellowship.org, shakespeareoxfordfellowship.org, to find your source and resource for all things Shakespeare authorship question. My guest today is a fellow Oxfordian and a fellow podcaster with his own podcast series. His name is John Brooks, and he is the creator and host of a series called Hard to Believe. I had the pleasure of being a guest on his series not too long ago, and so I asked John to join me today to be a guest here on Don't Quill the Messenger for you fellow Quillers. John, welcome.
Stephen, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. I like the reciprocity of the endeavor that we are working on together here. And what a lot of people maybe don't know, because they maybe haven't checked out your podcast yet, but they will now that they're hearing about it here on this episode, is that you have a very strong background in religious studies. And in fact, you teach that topic and that subject to very wealthy, very high-end prep school students, don't you?
I wouldn't say that necessarily all the time, but prep school students, yeah.
But and you're on the East Coast in Connecticut, is that correct?
East Coast elite prep school, yeah, that's right. Yeah. It's not really like that.
You fancy schmancy.
It's not quite what Catcher in the Rye would have you believe. But yeah, that is correct. I live in New England. I teach at a prep school, a small school that happens to have a religious studies department. And I've been teaching religious studies to high schoolers for 10 years now. So I bounced around a little bit before that. I did some work in journalism. I did some work in museum education, and then decided to go into the classroom. And that's what I've been doing for a decade.
Well, before we dive into the topic of conversation that I would like to explore with you on today's episode, why don't you tell us just a little bit about your podcast series, what it's about, what kind of features that you have, and how that came about for you?
Great questions. I'll try and break that down as best I can. So my series, Hard to Believe, is, I guess the best way to understand it is to understand how I came to the title, which is that it really is more than anything else a description of me. I have a hard time believing things, which is maybe strange for someone who teaches religious studies, but I remember a long time ago when I lived in Brooklyn, New York, and I was accosted by someone on the street, not in a violent way, but in one of those random New York moment ways. And this guy just came up to me and said, "What do you believe in?" And it was this very strange thing where I was like, I was obviously on the spot, but I said,
New York, and your crazy weirdos.
It is true. It was like a Wednesday afternoon. I just gotten home from work. And I said, I don't know. I don't think I believe in anything. And I just couldn't think of anything. And then I went home and thought about it some more. And I came to realize that really is sort of what defines my sort of professional life. I'm very interested in a lot of things. I'm interested in the way that people believe. I'm interested in what they believe. I'm interested in how those things manifest in the world. And that's why I study religion. It's why I teach religion. It fascinates me to no end. Now, I will say that I do believe that Edward de Vere was Shakespeare, but that is a belief that I came to after a very, very long time, right? Settling on something that I can be 100% comfortable with is not something that I'm great at. And, I still even kind of have my doubts, but that's one of the few things that I will say, like, yes, I believe that, right? Which ties into to your show and the Oxfordian life. But my show is I try and make it not all about cults and conspiracy theories. It tends to be overwhelmingly about cults and conspiracy theories far too often. But I try and branch out. I try and look at the elements of history that are misunderstood or poorly understood, how we came to believe things that are wrong, and explore things like philosophy and religion and so on and so forth. So, I cast sort of a wide net. The idea for the show came because a friend of mine, Joey Lewandowski, who I did a podcast with about sports a long time ago, back when podcasts were sort of in their infancy and nobody had any idea what they were doing. I then went on to have kids and family and all that sort of thing, and he went on to do a podcast about Nicolas Cage called Cage Club, which is he and a friend of his decided to watch every Nicolas Cage movie and do a podcast about each Nicolas Cage movie.
I'm really sorry. I'm really, really sorry for them. That sounds terrible. That sounds like self-inflicted torture. Why would you do that to yourself?
They both unabashedly love Nicolas Cage. I was on a couple episodes of that. It's a great show. It just in terms of discussing the phenomenon that is Nicolas Cage. But then they spun out to some other shows. They invited some more people onto their network, and then last spring I got in touch with Joey, and I was like, yeah, I'm thinking about finally doing my own show. He'd been sort of suggesting it a couple times here and there. And I was like, why not? And then COVID happened, and I suddenly had a lot of time to plan out these shows and work on them. And I have a little bit less time now, so I'm sort of a bit more stressed out about it. But I release them every week on Wednesdays. And yeah, I'm into my into my second year now, so that's that.
Did you have to tell my listeners that you have an episode every week? Because I get fan mail from people saying, how come you don't do it every week? And I can barely keep up with the every other week schedule. Don't throw me under the bus like that, brother.
All right. So podcast listeners, doing a podcast every week, especially when you don't have the backing of iHeartRadio or something like that, is really, really difficult. I do it. I used to do it every other week. I do it every week now just because I'm so eager. I have ideas and I have things I want to discuss and talk about and people I want to talk to. And it also really is now my social life because, I have 3 kids, the oldest of whom is 7, and I work full time, and so does my wife. So this is my like going out and hanging out with people time. So don't
we are definitely kindred spirits because, my wife and I have 3 kids, and our eldest is also 7. So,
well, there you go.
We're in the exact same boat here in a lot of different ways.
I have a 7.
So
and 2
it's a fascinating show. It's a fascinating show, and you do explore some very interesting topics, and including, you talk about religion in ways that I think other people might be afraid to discuss. You have a great episode about the devil, for instance, which is really incredible. So I'm hoping that my listeners, if they wanted to add a podcast to their series list, then they should definitely go and find you, and they can certainly find the episode where you mercilessly grilled me about Oxfordianism on your show. And so now I'm going to return the favor, because one of the things that I'd like to talk to you about is a topic that we address regularly in the Shakespeare authorship question realm, and that is the type of religious-like clinging to the Stratfordian myth that so many people in the world do and have, and the vitriolic response that we often get just by raising the question. And I'd like to hear from you as an expert in religious studies and in your experience as also an Oxfordian, of why you believe that sort of religious worship of Shakespeare of Stratford came to be and continues to exist.
Whoa, yeah, we did talk about this just very briefly when you were on my show, and Stephen, I think about this all the time. Since I became an Oxfordian, I think about this all the time, and interestingly, like one of the things that got me back into thinking about the authorship question was I had started reading some of the really good scholarship questioning the traditional Jesus of Nazareth model, which is to say that in my world, there is the generally accepted idea that some variation of a guy named Jesus of Nazareth existed some 2,000 years ago, walked around place to place, hung out with John the Baptist, had a little group of followers and unexpectedly died in a Roman cross. And then his followers, thought he came back to life 3 days later. Most scholars will tell you that they think some variation of that is basically true, right? So that whether it's the maximalist view that you will find in a church or the typical scholarly view of like, yeah, well, there was this guy and he was a Messiah claimants were a dime a dozen, and so on and so forth, right? So there's a sort of spectrum within there that is accepted. And there's also, there has been in the last couple decades some doubt on whether or not that actually is the real narrative of how Christianity came to be and who we should look to and where we should look for Jesus. And so what's known as the quest for the historical Jesus, right? This massive academic failure of the last 100 years or so, of trying to find a Jesus in history and pluck him out, has led some scholars to think, well, maybe we should revisit whether or not there was a Jesus of Nazareth, and if that is really the origin of Christianity. And of course, when that happens, there's always cranks, right? There's always people who come in and write their conspiracy theory books. There's a guy named Joseph Atwill, who's the most famous among the mythicists, who is, not regarded highly by either side of it. He's a guy trying to sell books, and he makes up all this junk, poorly researched conspiracy nonsense about Jesus being a invention of the Roman Empire to control the Jewish. It doesn't make any sense. But within that, there's also
that's a stretch.
Yeah.
That's a crazy stretch.
Yeah, it's bad. It doesn't make any. It's dumb. People should not listen to it. But it sells books because it's inflammatory and pretty typical of crank scholarship. But there are a few people who have credibility, who a couple of years ago I started looking into and started reading and taking seriously what they had to say. I think the best of them is a guy named Richard Carrier, who wrote a very, very long book. The only peer-reviewed, I think, to date, book on this topic, called on the Historicity of Jesus. And so anyway, like, long story short, that's what kind of got me back into the Oxford thing. I started looking at this and saying, like, yeah, why don't we know more about Jesus? Like, why is this person who supposedly performed miracles like walking on water not referenced by anybody else of the era? And I came to realize, actually, a turning point for me was a guy named Bart Ehrman, who's a really, really great scholar of early Christianity. He wrote a book called "Did Jesus Exist?" and I was really excited to read that because I've read all of Ehrman's books and I love his work, and I was really excited to read it. And I read it, and it. This is where the Oxford thing comes in. It was so crushingly disappointing because it was written like one of those Shakespeare biographies, where it's sort of like it had maybe two pieces of pretty good evidence and the rest of it was just sort of conjecture. And then, we must assume that so and so and such and such. And I was like, wow, this is all there is. This isn't very satisfactory.
I love those. Those are my favorites. My favorite Stratfordian statements are, well, we can assume and we must agree and it's most likely and
Right.
and based on what was going on in other places at the time, it was probably like this.
Right.
I love that aspect, and I think that that's why I draw that correlation, because I feel like in order to believe that the Stratford man was the literary god Shakespeare,
Right.
you have to have as much faith in that as you would in many of the world's religions and people who follow those religions.
Right. Right. And I have to say, like in the case of Ehrman, he also reminds me of a kind of a Christianity equivalent of a Stratfordian, because he is someone who is a former fundamentalist Christian as a youth who turned in, he became an academic, and in being an academic realized that the Bible was not inerrant, and so he turned into an agnostic / atheist scholar. And he seems to me like the kind of person who should be really primed to really challenge this question head on, and he doesn't. And I find that, really sort of indicative of something that I think is very similar to the Stratfordian insistence of holding on to this narrative, where even the people that you would think would, be perfect candidates for really seriously questioning this idea don't do it, and they don't do it for reasons that are beyond money. In the case of some so-called Shakespeare scholars, they do it because they want to hold on to something that is religious and certain, right? And also that is a wonderful myth. It's a wonderful fantasy about what they also could achieve if they hang out in the right bars, and if they talk to the right people.
The Mermaid Tavern of Eternal Knowledge.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing, other part for me personally is that I'm English by birth and by family. I was born in the UK. I've lived in the States since I was 3 years old. But the other thing is that I know for England, the identification of Stratford, the place and the man, are part of the DNA of the identity of that culture. And I think that's part of the Stratfordian stubbornness that we tend to maybe overlook sometimes. If I can use a metaphor, it would be like if there was credible evidence that Paul McCartney really was dead, and that Billy Shears actually has been the bassist or was the bassist, right? And it has been the person doing Paul McCartney's solo career all this time. If that conspiracy theory, as it turned out, were true, and there was really good evidence to support that theory, right? It would be a similar kind of thing. It would so upset this cultural icon for Britain that it's the sort of thing that you would just reject even if it were overwhelmingly evident. Now, of course, Paul McCartney is not dead, and that conspiracy theory is nonsense, but the Shakespeare one isn't, right? And the Shakespeare one has overwhelming evidence to say that Stratford was not Shakespeare.
Well, one of the interesting things you pointed out, I think that needs to be further touched on, and I think is a road for Shakespeare authorship doubters, and certainly a road for Oxfordians, is you talked about the historical Shakespeare, and I use that in reference because you talked about the historical Jesus. And it's ironic to me that people who would argue against Christianity because there is no strong historical Jesus other than the Bible are the same people who cleave to this belief of a Stratfordian man who is Shakespeare, even though there is no real historical Shakespeare there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think that might also, there's something really, there's a book waiting to be written there, Stephen. You know what I mean? Like there's something about
well, you better get on that.
I have enough on my plate right now. There's something about the secular religion, because, you make a really interesting point, but the reason that kind of makes sense to me is that a lot of, especially in the West, a lot of intellectuals, I hate to use that term, but free thinking people reject Christianity because
the intelligentsia, as it were.
They reject theism, right? But they're still looking for some kind of underlying magic in the world, and the Stratford story offers that. God doesn't have to be involved, but you have this miracle man who tells you, he's like over your shoulder telling you, like, you can do it, right? Like, look what I did. I came from nowhere and wrote all the greatest works of literature in English language history. You got this, right? And it's sort of like your little guardian angel Stratford over your shoulder. And you don't need to believe any kind of a creed. You don't have to read the Bible, which is great. You can read Hamlet instead. And I can see the appeal, because one of the things that in my work has been abundantly obvious is that people, even if they say they don't like religion, people love religion and they want it badly. They just want a religion that they can believe in, and they can believe and want to believe that this man from Stratford was Shakespeare. And it is as though you are trying to dislodge their belief. It's the same thing where, like, I know you've had this frustration, and so have I, is that when we try to sort of start converting people, evidence doesn't always work. They have to come to it emotionally first, right? Like, and it's the same thing with, like, you can't just debunk Christianity to a firm believer. That's why it's so hard to sway Stratfordians, I think, because it's not really about the evidence. If it was about the evidence, we'd have had them all a long time ago, right? It's about the emotion. It's about the religious connection to this person and this story that doesn't require God, and so can be its own kind of secular cultural religion.
I really like your analogy and the way you painted the picture of, sort of this little miniature bald-headed man sitting on the shoulder of those who want to achieve greatness in their lives in some way, listening to this whispering, angelic Shakespeare that is telling them, I've got your back. I am your inspiration, your source, your muse of fire, as it were, to help you to achieve all greatness. I really love that analogy. And I think you really touch on something there. When I was a child, my grandmother used to tell me that there was an angel sitting on one shoulder and a devil sitting on the other. And she said the angel sat on my left shoulder because that was closest to your heart, but that my head was always turned to the right. My grandmother Stella used to say that to me. Your analogy paints that same sort of graphic picture in my mind of, and you're right, it's almost like people need little bobblehead Shakespeares on the dashboards of their cars to protect them from accidents now. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I do. And the other thing, and I think we should turn this on ourselves as well, is that, look, let's face it, Oxfordians are religious too, right? I mean, like, it itself is its own little splinter sort of Lutheran, break off religion from the main line. And I'm sure I can speak for you when I say this. I don't know if you ever thought about your connection to the greater Oxfordian community as being a religion, but for me, it's one of those things that religions always provide a sense of community and belonging, and people who see the world the way that you do and have the secret knowledge that you also have. And all of that, I think, if you look at it from the basic framework of religion, and from that perspective, that's what the Oxfordians are. And we would love to convert people, and we find it really frustrating and challenging, right? It's like being a Mormon missionary. It's like people slam the door in your face all the time, but we don't let it go. We don't let that get to us, because we have the capital T truth on our side, so to speak. And and I'm not saying that to say that I think that Oxfordians are delusional in any way. I agree with them, and I have been baptized right into that movement. But I also think that we approach our Shakespeare with and approach De Vere with a religious reverence, and as a community of people, feel that sort of religious connection to other people who see things the way that we see them, who understand the sonnets the way we understand them, who understand the plays the way we understand them, right? And so I think it works both ways. That Shakespeare looms so large over Western culture that any version of him will be experienced in this kind of religious framework.
So your premise is that 100 years ago, J. Thomas Loney basically nailed the new precepts onto the door of the Shakespeare Church and created a new religion. And here we are now 100 years later. And so I'm the modern Saint Paul preaching to the Quiller Nation.
Oh, I don't think you're Paul. Maybe you're John Calvin. I'm not sure. No, look at, I think let's go back to that for a second. If you look at Loney, what Loney was doing was the exact same thing as Martin Luther, right? There was this Martin Luther was disillusioned by what he had been told was in the Bible, because for 1,300 years, the Catholic Church has been like, well, it's all in this book. You don't have to read it. It's ours. But this is what it says. So yes, you have to go confess to a priest when you do something bad, right? And if you don't, you're going to hell. It's all in here. And then Luther, who had grown up and been in that world very, very intensely, decided to check that out. Right? He took a look at the book and he was like, oh, it doesn't say that at all. And in fact, the whole priest thing isn't in this book. And I think that there's something, that's what Loney was doing, right? He was like, wait a second. Is everything that we're told about this William Shakespeare person, backed up by facts? And he just looked at the facts and said, oh, they're not. But here's this other guy, right, who this makes a lot more sense for. So, I do think you can draw, I know you said so sort of in jest, but I think you can draw a very clear parallel between the reform of Martin Luther and Loney. But luckily, we haven't ended up killing hundreds of thousands of people as a consequence yet.
Although there have been a few strats who have become so angry with me at discussing this topic that I have been in fear of personal harm on occasion, I have to tell you.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that I'm talking about, and why we're having this conversation is it does seem like this particular topic can incense people to such a degree that ought not to be there. It's just plays and poems and a writer. But yet some people get so angry when you challenge what they believe they know that it can disrupt families. It can disrupt gatherings. It can cause people not to speak to one another again. I have a few, I guess they call them former friends, who will absolutely not speak to me now because I challenged their Shakespeare. And one of the side elements of that I've noticed with several of them has to do with a certain amount of reverence that they feel in their lives toward the English teacher or literature professor that they had in their lives who sparked their love for the works. And do you find that to be connected in any way in your experience?
You mean to people who are devoutly religious, as being connected to the people who give them that religion, or is that what you're
yes,
asking?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So there are people who I know who, well, wait a minute, Mr. McNeil was my high school literature teacher, and he said,
Right.
and I loved Mr. McNeil, and Mr. McNeil was the most awesome teacher in the world. And not only did he turn me on to Shakespeare, but he also turned me on to all the other great writers that I love. And he's like a god to me because he introduced me to all this great literature. And how dare you challenge not only Shakespeare, but poor old Mr. McNeil?
Right. I do. I think that's a really great observation. I hadn't really thought about it in those terms before, but yeah, if you look at, especially, I think a lot of Catholics, there seems to be like a weird kind of transition phase for Catholics where, you start out as a kid and you just hate going to church and you hate the whole thing, and maybe you're dragged to Catholic school or whatever. And then as a teenager, you might get into the, you love the church because your grandma loves the church and you love your grandma, right? Or your grandpa. There's a cultural and personal connection to it, which then tends to lead people into an adulthood of being loyal to the church by proxy because of the people that they associate the church with. And then by the time they're 70, they're fully on board believers, right? And in a lot of ways, that is how the Catholic Church has survived over time. It's how it's been able to transcend generations, is by having these kind of like family connections or teachers or figures who spoke to a certain person at a certain time, that connected to them. So yeah, and I think that again, so much of religion is emotional, and not in the way necessarily that I mean that it's emotional that it supersedes rationality, but rather that what we inherit is a really grand tradition that is steeped in storytelling and emotion that people crave and need, right? And I think you're exactly right in saying that a lot of the people who cling to Stratford are really clinging to their beloved English teacher from ninth grade or whatever it is, right? That's part of the big package of ideas that they don't want to let go of. At the core of which, again, is this very appealing notion of this dude who defied the odds and became by pure grit the greatest writer of all time, which again just speaks to a lot of our cultural biases, right? That we don't want to we don't want to lose. And like, again, getting back to Jesus, right? Part of the I think the reason why a lot of people are, even atheists, are unwilling to let go of the historical Jesus is because the historical Jesus is still, even if you strip everything away, you have to accept that he died on a Roman cross, and then somehow, for whatever reason, 3 days later, all of his pals were like, he didn't really die. And even if you are a skeptic, you have to accept that part of it, right? That they believed he wasn't dead. And I think people have a hard time letting go of that. Anytime there's this wonderful underdog story, especially of the two most famous people in Western history, in the case of Jesus and Shakespeare, you're going to have a really hard time dislodging that. And I think one of the things that's great about the Oxford story is that it's so rich, that it's not just a better playwright. It's not just a guy who's better at writing and more intellectually and academically equipped to write the plays and the sonnets than William Shakespeare was, but that, as I know you very well know, there's a really deep, rich emotional story of a really vivid person in there, that I'm grateful for, because I think if it was just another playwright, if it was just, say, Marlowe, right, I don't think anybody would care, because what's the difference at that point, right? If it's Marlowe or Shakespeare, who cares? But De Vere's story is better, and I think that gives me optimism that we can one day convince people.
I absolutely agree with you, and certainly for me that is, and for me as a theater artist, that is certainly the strongest connection that sings to me, for a lack of a better word, and I can't help but, now that I know the life of Edward de Vere, I can't help but read the works of Shakespeare and see him everywhere, in everything, because I know so much of his biography that it just pops out. It just jumps off the page at you. And the more I research and the more I learn and the more scholarly guests I have on this program who enlighten me further week after week, episode after episode, the more that continues to ring true with me every time I open up my complete works, or I open up the sonnets, or I am working on a production with actors. I'm about to embark on my 9th production of A Midsummer Night's Dream this summer. Mm-hmm. And I'm certain that through the rehearsal process, there will be even more new revelations, new experiences that I will find in the text, that I will see, that I will relate and connect to him. You know what I mean?
Yep. Yeah. And also, if you don't mind,
I don't think that you can say that about about Shakespeare.
No, because we can't say anything about. I mean, it's unless you think that all of the plays are about trading grain, then I guess I guess if you see that, then sure. But can I ask you a question? Because you said something earlier that I want to just pick apart really quickly, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So my question for you is, you mentioned that you had lost some friendships over the authorship question, and since we're sort of talking about this in terms of a commitment to an idea or to a cause that we often associate with religiosity, and of course people lose friends over religion all the time, I wonder why you chose those. You chose Oxford, you chose De Vere over those friendships. Why not just sort of smile and nod and move on and keep those friends? Why choose Oxford?
Well, with some friendships that I have in my life, I've had to just agree with those people to not talk about this topic anymore in order to salvage those friendships. Like, we've literally have come to the determination they're not going to yield, I'm not going to yield, And so, but yet we love each other and we care about each other. And so this is just a topic we're not going to discuss. It might be similar with religion. We might not discuss God for that very same reason. Right now in the world, there are people who I cannot have a discussion about COVID vaccines with right now. There are people I can't have a conversation about masks with right now if I want to keep them in my life. So, there are plenty of topics. However, I do feel like there have been instances where I have attempted to express why this is so important to me, and the amount of attention I give to it in my life and how important it is to my life, in that I host this podcast. I'm a member of SOF. I have served as their PR director. I serve as their outreach director. And for people to be flat out dismissive of that in the ways that some people have been is not only offensive to my ideology, but it's offensive to my life, in the sense that, okay, well then if you don't appreciate that this is a part of my life, you don't have to agree with it, but how does it hurt you that you're going to then attack me for it, or use ad hominem attacks, or call me, a tin hat, conspiracy wacko, whatever, you know what I mean? So that I think it's more about the approach than it is about the topic when it has ended relationships.
Yeah, and I think that sort of that analogy to a commitment to a worldview that reflects values is a really interesting one that you can only really find outside of religion, I think, with the Shakespeare question. Because, I think, like, if someone came to me and said, well, Dan Brown didn't really write the Da Vinci Code, I'd be like, okay, I don't care. You know what I mean? It's not just about an author and a question about the author. There is something about the way that Shakespeare as a concept has burrowed itself into our entire sort of Western worldview, that the relationship a person has, whether it be our side of the fence or the Stratfordian side of the fence, is so attached to a fundamental worldview and set of values and beliefs that it can be very, very hard to maintain safe distance with people in certain settings, right? So, like, I don't care.
How do you deal with it on the campus of your school? Obviously, you teach at a school. You must have colleagues who are literature and English teachers.
Sure.
And they must know, or are you a closet Oxfordian at work? Like, how do you deal with it with your colleagues?
Well, I don't go to lunch every day and say, so, if you look at the, sonnet, I don't know, whatever. It's hard to weave it into conversation, shall we say. So it's not something I wear on my sleeve, but I think most of my colleagues don't even know what my religious views are. I don't even know what they are, to be completely honest. I have tried on a couple of occasions with, especially some of the colleagues who teach English, in social settings, to sort of bring it up and say, like, yeah, I'm an Oxfordian, and here's why. And I don't get a ton of pushback, mostly because the teachers who teach that subject here are roughly my age, and our generation is, I think, just more default to open-minded than other generations are. So we tend to be less attached to old narratives than maybe some older people are, and maybe that just happens more and more with age. I don't really know. but no, I've never converted anybody, except my wife, who we watched Last Will and Testament, the documentary, together, and she was like, oh well, duh. And she's an actor and she's a big Shakespeare fan, and she was like, oh, of course, this makes perfect sense. So that didn't take very long to get her on board, and then we spent the whole night arguing about the Prince Tudor theory and various variations of it, which was really fun. But aside from my wife, I haven't converted anybody, and I'm not sure that I ever will, and I would love to, because it's one of those things, like, again, I'm not preoccupied with the idea of convincing people. I don't go around being like, it's all a lie, right? And with my hair on fire. Although that's what's happening inside.
What? What are you waiting for, you slacker? Get out there and make some converts. Shame on you.
But I know you told me a similar sort of thing, which is like, if it sort of comes up, and if there's an entry point with an actor or whatever, then yeah, you sort of you get into that territory and you sort of see where it goes. I would love everybody I know to understand it the way I understand it, and to see what I see. And I just listened to your most recent episode with children, and she makes the same sort of point. I think that both of you do, that it's just so much richer, and I want you to see it. I want you to see it the way that I see it, and to understand that, like, it changes everything about your appreciation of Shakespeare. And of course, you can appreciate Shakespeare without knowing any biographical detail about him whatsoever, but you appreciate it so much more when you see it in the context of De Vere's life. And it resurrects this person who has been banished from history, right? It's this like, it's like this magical box where De Vere's story was buried, and it comes back to life, and it's just this wonderful sort of like magical thing that happens. And of course I want to express that to everybody.
It's true. It's the buried treasure of the Shakespearean canon. It really is. De Vere's life is the buried treasure where X marks the spot, and dig here and you will find a plethora of jewels and gold to mine, and it will enrich you in so many ways as you then revisit each work, each play, each sonnet, suddenly becomes revealed to you in a new way. And you're right, that is the way I think a lot of us feel. And so we have to balance that passion that we have for this topic and this man and this travesty of historical justice with rationale and reason, and not overwhelming people around us. Dr. Earl Showerman, who's a common guest on my program, says that he is referred to in his family as the how does he say it now? Oxford noxious. he's obnoxious. He's Oxford noxious, or like something that, to that degree. If he were here, he's going to send me an email now with the actual term. Yeah. But he's the obnoxious Oxfordian in his family, and I am too in my family. For anybody who will listen and anybody who cares, and I have several family members who are like, yeah, I don't care, and that's fine. That's true too. But just recently, so I have, and here's a shameless plug, I have a Don't Quill the Messenger face covering. You can buy them online. Go to don'tquillthepodcast.com and go to the Quiller shop and get your Quiller swag, and you can get your Don't Quill the Messenger face covering. So I wear it at work, and one of my colleagues at work asked me about the image, because she said, oh, your face covering is like a mask within a mask behind a mask. I said, that's exactly right. It is. It's like a triple mask. And she said, what's it mean? What's it about? And I said, oh, this is the logo of my podcast series. And we started talking about that. She said, I didn't know you had a podcast series. That opened the door. What's it about? That opened the door.
Right.
And she said, oh, I've heard stuff about that. I've read a little bit about that. I don't know a lot about it. I said, I have a book for you if you're interested. And I brought her a copy of Mark Anderson's Shakespeare by Another Name. And I said, here, this is my gift to you. go ahead and read it. Once she reads that book, I guarantee she's going to be a convert. I buy up used copies of that book just for this purpose, just to give it to people like that.
Yeah. I guess I now regret not having a face mask of the podcast while I was still in school this year, because I'm not sure I'll be wearing one at the beginning of next year. I missed the boat there. Yeah, and
God, let's hope not.
I do sometimes feel a little bit like a Mormon missionary, and just being like, trying to talk to people at the door and having it slammed on my face, and I don't really like that idea. I wish people just would see things, see the truth as it is. But I often sort of also think of the story of the Buddha as a way of sort of not to equate myself or you or anybody else with the Buddha, but that feeling of the Buddha sort of being disillusioned with the way that the world worked, and going around from wise man to wise man, and all of them saying, "Oh yes, I have the answer, and here it is." And he said, "Okay, and I'll put it into practice." And then he did, and then it didn't work, and then he went on to the next one, and so on and so forth. And I often think of the Stratfordians as sort of that way. Like I kept believing that they knew what they were talking about, and kept reading their books and coming up empty. And then sort of, Siddhartha being like, all right, screw it. I'm going to sit at this tree until I figure it out. And then I'm going to figure it out. And then I'm going to tell everybody that I can. And if none of them listen to me, that's a shame. But I have all the secret knowledge now, right? And and if you want to talk about like the classic Oxfordian origin story, it goes something like that, right? For sort of everybody in this little group. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that there's no way of approaching your understanding of Shakespeare in a way that doesn't in some way reflect the story of religion, because Shakespeare is a religion. I mean, Shakespeare is so deeply entrenched in our Western worldview that there's just no way around it. It is you're going to either love it and accept it, or reject it, or whatever. But in the same way that you do Christianity or anything else, and if someone has a Christianity that they are deeply connected to, even if it doesn't fit with facts and logic and reason, they are going to cling to it, and no amount of but hey, check out this guy is ever going to change that. So in some ways I'm sort of pessimistic that we're ever going to get.
I'm glad that you mentioned the Buddha, and because we've talked a lot about, in comparison to Christianity, and we've touched on the Catholic Church and the history of that, but we haven't talked about some of the other religions in the world and whether or not Stratfordianism equates to some of those religions in that same sort of way. So I'm glad that you mentioned Buddhism, but obviously as a guy who spends his life in religious studies, you've studied all of the major religions of the world, I'm sure. And how would you say it equates to, like, say, Islamic fundamentalism, or the plethora of Hindu beliefs that are out there? Like, are there comparisons to be drawn in those ways, or no?
I think all fundamentalisms are basically the same, and I think that the majority of people who investigate the authorship question and still come back to Stratford are fundamentalists. There's really to me, there's no other way of really describing it. It is, if you are a scholar, if you're the average person who watches, Romeo and Juliet and thinks Shakespeare is great, even though you don't quite understand it, but understand how beautiful it is and yada, yada, yada. I get you not really caring, right? You're like a Christmas and Easter Christian. I get it. You don't, it doesn't matter to you. If you genuinely investigate the topic and you still come back to Stratford, I can't see that as anything other than fundamentalism. And fundamentalism exists across all religions. Every religion has fundamentalists. And it's always reactionary, right? Fundamentalism is not the default position of anybody. It is always a reaction. And it's usually a reaction to some kind of perceived or real threat to the tradition, right? And you can kind of see where I'm going here. That to me is when you look at these diehard Stratfordians, that seems to be the common thread all the time. Is they are threatened by a they're threatened because they know the writing's on the wall. They know the evidence is there, right? I look at Galileo; it's the same thing. They knew that Galileo had the data, right? That the Earth was not the center of the universe, and that's why it was threatening, and that's why you double down.
That's a great example, and it's a great example on a variety of different levels, not only in the persecution and rejection of the data that Galileo did have, but also in the way that they attempted to destroy him and lock him away the way that they did, and sometimes I feel like that's how Stratfordians react to Oxfordians is, we must break you. We must destroy you.
Right.
It's like a bad Rocky movie.
And I don't think the one thing I will say, like, I don't want to build us as a group up to be the victims in some noble crusade, right, against the because no Stratfordians are burning us at the stake. I mean, at least there's that. And I haven't been threatened with beheading or anything else, or house arrest or anything along those lines. So I don't want to build up a kind of martyr complex for Oxfordians. But at the same time, it's not. I do understand the Stratfordians are as not as. I mean, in some cases there is obviously a money interest involved, and they are preserving the bag, so to speak, to use the modern parlance. But I don't think of them as malicious, and I don't necessarily think of fundamentalists as necessarily driven by malice, so much as driven by a fear of losing something that they have been so certain about for so long. And again, I sympathize with it. I told you when you were on my show that it took me a long time to fully let go of the Stratford myth. And you do lose something when that happens. I'll use to sort of push this religion analogy even further out. I'm a lifelong Red Sox fan. Which is itself a religion, right? And
yes, I think it is.
Yeah, and when 2004 happened, I was 25 years old, and I had been waiting for that moment for my entire life. It was always next year. It was always 80 whatever years now, and we knew how long it had been since 1918, and we always knew that it was never going to happen in our lifetimes. And of course, the Red Sox were never going to win the World Series. And when they did, it was, of course, this moment that I will never forget. I won't forget anything about the weeks of that. I was in New York City at the time, which is great because I could throw it in the Yankees fans' faces. But, there was also, after the fact, this incredible feeling of loss, right? That I'd lost this identity that I'd always had of this team that was never going to win the World Series, that was so part of my sort of Bostonian cultural identity. And you could feel it in the city as well, right? So I think whenever we're presented with whatever it is of losing some kind of inherited idea or identity or tradition, even if the tradition is being losers, I think that carries with it a great deal of anxiety and a great deal of sadness, and I think that's what drives a lot of the Stratfordians, and it's what drives a lot of fundamentalism as well.
That's really profound, and I think that you're spot on to a large degree there, especially Very recently, I gave a presentation to a group of people about the Shakespeare authorship question. And as I scanned the room, making eye contact with the various people in the audience, you can always find the ones who are leaning forward and who are intrigued and excited and very interested. And you can always find the ones that are like, closed armed and scowling and very, I won't listen to this. You're a heretic. It's sacrilege. Again, those using those terms of religion. But there was one particular gentleman who was there who afterwards, who I thought, oh God, this guy is going to come after me. Like he's going to come tear me apart with questions about why this and why that. And I was completely wrong. Instead, what he did is he came to me and he said, I'm so mad. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, I'm so mad that no one ever told me this before, that no one ever shared this with me. I'm mad at my high school English teachers. I'm mad at my college professors. I'm mad at all of the people who led me to believe this big lie that you have now just shown me is nothing but a big lie. And I found that to be like the greatest conversion. Like he'll get over his anger. And then he'll go and do some additional research and become a staunch Oxfordian in the future, right? But his initial reaction was, like you say, like pain, loss, anger at the loss. And so I think you're spot on there.
Yeah. It's a great story, and I think that is I think that's something that as a teacher I've seen plenty of times, right? That before you can learn something new, you have to let go of something old, and it's hard to do that, and people aren't great at it, and we just love to cling to the certainties and the stories that we grew up with, and when we, it's like finding out Santa Claus isn't real, right? It's the same thing. It's you're letting go of something that changes your worldview and informs it and gives it this magic, and that it's better to not believe in it anymore. When you're like 18, right? But it's hard. It is a loss, even when you find out this profound truth.
Except I think we know more about Santa Claus than we actually know about the Stratford.
Oh, there you go.
So there you go. There's a. Like, I think I know more about the origins of St. Nicholas and Santa Claus than I do about this, grain dealer from Stratford.
And I have an episode about that too, so you can go back to the archives and find my Santa Claus episode.
I'll bet you do. That's hard to believe.
Ah, very nice.
Yeah, so I say this often, and I'm certain that you'll agree with me, especially you deal with young people so much in your life. And I don't know how long you've been teaching at the high school level, but I had a stint of 7 years teaching high school. And one of the things that I feel is true about everyone, but it's most particularly true about adolescents and young adults, is one of the hardest things we ever have to do in life as human beings is grieve the loss of our dreams and replace them with new ones. And so it makes sense that you say that in order to learn something new, you've got to let go of something old. And that is a very difficult transition for a lot of people to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, and high schoolers are going through enough of a, sort of intellectual and personal and emotional Armageddon in their teenage angst that, it can be really difficult. But it's also when you see a student sort of get to from point A to point B, and you see that transition happen, and you let them sort of sit with it and internalize it. It's the most incredibly gratifying thing. I don't like to be too philosophical about it because I sure wish I made more money, but like it's better than any amount of money. You know what I mean? In the long run, like it's what it's what I think back on. And again, it's one of those things where it's why I want to convince people of the Oxford theory, because the rare time that it does happen, it's really great to see that all those pieces fall into place, and that someone is seeing the world more vividly than they had previously.
So I'm going to say that the big takeaway from our conversation today as Oxfordians, and to share with our fellow Quillers who are out there listening, is that we need to try to be understanding of that process for Stratfordians, and maybe hold their hand a little bit more through their process of grieving the loss of this religion, this myth that they've been clinging to for so long, that has been indoctrinated into them throughout their lives, and help them deal with their feelings of anger and their feelings of being threatened by what it is that we're sharing with them, in the sense of hoping that by doing so, by being, kinder, gentler Oxfordians, we mitigate better the backlash that we tend to receive from them when we try to beat them over the head with "your guy is not the guy" type of message.
Yeah, well said. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you, John. It's been a fascinating conversation. It's definitely an aspect of this that I haven't covered before. I think we tread into some delicate waters, and I'll be curious to see what kind of responses I receive from the listeners on this episode. But isn't that what it's all about? I mean, that's why we're here. And I do want to encourage all those Quillers out there, please send us your responses, send us your replies, give us your ideas, your suggestions for future episodes. We love to hear from you. You can reach me at contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com. contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com. If you're interested in adding a podcast series to your listening lineup, please go check out John's podcast, Hard to Believe, and that's on the Cage Network, right? Is that what it's called?
Cage Club Network, yeah. Yep.
Cage Club Network, just like our podcast is on the Dragon Wagon Radio Network. So you can find John's podcast and a list of others that you might be interested if you go to the Cage Club Network. So one network supporting another. Great to have you, and thank you so much for joining us for this episode. We're so glad that you choose to welcome us into your life for your listening pleasure wherever you are. And as you go out about your next 2 weeks, waiting for the next exciting episode to hit your streaming platform, please do remember, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.